Ever feel like AI is playing a game of Simon Says with instructions, but sometimes it just doesn't listen? We're diving deep into that today, because it turns out how you tell an AI what to do matters a whole lot.
Exactly. We're unpacking 5 fascinating papers that tackle some seriously cool problems. First, we'll look at how the order of instructions messes with AI's head. Think of it like giving directions. Start with the tricky turns, then the easy stuff. Next, we're building AI detectives that can discover hidden connections in graphs, even when they only get yes or no answers. Then we're tackling AI hallucinations, those moments when AI sees things that aren't really there in images. After that, we're exploring how to give AI a theory of mind, basically teaching it to understand what you're thinking. Finally, we're going microscopic, exploring how AI is revolutionizing protein science. Buckle up, it's going to be a wild ride.
Okay, so this paper dives into something called position bias in large language models, or LLMs, specifically when they're given instructions with multiple constraints.
Position bias? What's that in this context?
Think of it like this. If you tell an LLM to write a story, but also tell it that it must be in exactly 100 words, must include a dragon, and must rhyme, the order you give those instructions can affect how well the LLM follows them all.
That's wild. So the same instructions just shuffled can lead to different results.
Exactly. And this paper is the first to really dig into why this happens with multiple constraints. They've found that LLMs tend to perform better when the constraints are presented in a hard-to-easy order.
Hard to easy? How do they even define hard and easy for constraints?
That's where it gets interesting. They came up with a metric called the Constraint Difficulty Distribution Index, or CDDI. Basically, they measure how often an LLM fails to follow a specific constraint. The more it fails, the harder that constraint is considered to be.
So it's empirically determined, not just a subjective assessment. That makes sense. So a constraint that requires a specific rare word might be harder than one that just asks for a certain length.
Precisely. And they found that when they give the LLM the hardest constraints first, followed by the easier ones, the overall performance improves.
That's counterintuitive. You'd think you'd want to ease the model in. Why do they think this hard-to-easy approach works better?
They did some explanation studies, looking at where the LLM is focusing its attention. It seems that when the hard constraints come first, the LLM dedicates more attention to the constraint part of the instruction overall. It's like it sets the stage for following all the rules.
So it's not just about the individual constraints, but how the model processes the entire instruction based on the order. What about different LLMs? Does this hard-to-easy preference hold across the board?
That's a key finding. They tested various LLMs, both open source and closed source, with different architectures and sizes, and the hard-to-easy preference was consistent across them all.
That's a pretty robust result. So if I'm crafting instructions for an LLM, I should consciously think about the relative difficulty of my constraints and order them accordingly.
That's the takeaway. It's a simple tweak that could potentially boost performance without any extra training or fine-tuning. They also looked at multi-round inference, where you give the LLM the core instruction and then add constraints iteratively.
Ah, like a conversation. How does position bias play out there?
It's even more pronounced. The performance gap between easy to hard and hard to easy widens significantly in multi-round scenarios. So the order really matters when you're interacting with an LLM conversationally.
This is fascinating. It highlights how sensitive these models are to seemingly minor changes in input. What are the limitations of this study?
They mainly focused on constraints that are independent of each other. So, changing the order doesn't affect the semantic meaning of the instructions. They acknowledge that the position bias with sequential constraints, where the order does change the meaning, needs more exploration.
That makes sense. Like first write a summary, then translate it to Spanish, versus first translate it to Spanish, then write a summary. Those are very different tasks. So future work could look at those kinds of dependencies?
Exactly. And they also point out that they've only investigated the phenomenon of position bias, not a solution to mitigate it. So the next step could be developing techniques to make LLMs less sensitive to constraint order.
Right? To make them more robust and reliable. Still, this is a really valuable contribution. It gives us a practical insight into how to better interact with LLMs and get the most out of them.
All right, let's dive into this paper on interactive graph discovery using large language models, or LLMs. The title is IGDA Interactive Graph Discovery Through Large Language Model Agents. It's all about how LLMs can help us figure out relationships between variables, like cause and effect.
Sounds interesting. So instead of crunching numbers, these LLMs are using semantic metadata, basically the meaning behind the variable names and descriptions, to predict how things connect. That's a pretty different approach.
Exactly. The core idea is to use LLMs to build a graph, where nodes are variables and edges show how they influence each other. The challenge is to get as close as possible to the ground truth graph, which represents the real relationships, by doing experiments and updating our predictions.
Okay, so it's like a detective game. We start with a guess, then run experiments to get clues and refine our understanding of the connections. What kind of experiments are we talking about here?
The paper keeps the experiment part pretty abstract. It just needs to give a binary feedback. Yes or no. Does this edge exist or not? In practice, this could be anything from a controlled lab experiment to a randomized trial. The key is that it tells us whether one variable affects another.
Got it. So the LLM acts as an agent that picks which relationships to test and then updates its understanding based on the results. How does it decide which experiments to run?
That's where the IGDA part comes in, Interactive Graph Discovery Agent. It uses an uncertainty-driven approach. The LLM estimates how unsure it is about each potential connection, and then it prioritizes experiments on the edges it's most uncertain about.
That makes sense. Focus on the areas where you're most confused. But how does the LLM actually update its graph after each experiment?
It uses a local graph update strategy. When an experiment confirms or denies a connection, the LLM doesn't just update that one edge. It also revises its predictions for neighboring edges, ones that share a parent or child variable with the experimented edge.
Ah, so it's like saying if A affects B, then maybe A also affects C. It's using the new information to update its understanding of the whole local network around that edge.
Precisely. The authors tested IGDA on 8 real-world graphs and found it often beat other methods, including a state-of-the-art numerical approach. They even tested it on a brand-new causal graph about protein transcription factors, where memorization wouldn't be a factor.
That's a good way to check if the LLM is actually reasoning or just regurgitating information it's seen before. So, what are the key takeaways from this research?
Well, first, it introduces interactive graph discovery as a way to evaluate LLM capabilities. Second, it shows that uncertainty-guided edge selection is a good strategy for prioritizing experiments. And third, it demonstrates that this local update strategy is effective for refining the predicted graph based on experimental feedback.
It sounds like a promising approach, especially when you don't have a ton of numerical data to work with. The LLM's ability to leverage semantic metadata could be a real game changer in those situations.
Definitely. The paper also dives into the background, comparing this approach to traditional causal discovery methods and other ways LLMs are used for optimization. It highlights that many existing methods struggle with noisy data or make assumptions that don't hold true in the real world.
Right, like assuming the graph is acyclic, meaning there are no feedback loops. That's a pretty strong assumption that doesn't always hold up.
Exactly. IGDA doesn't make that assumption, which makes it more flexible. It also doesn't rely on having lots of observational or interventional data, which can be expensive to get.
So it's trading numerical data for semantic knowledge. Interesting. The paper also mentions using LLMs as black box optimizers. How does that fit in?
That's a related area of research where LLMs are used to find the best solution to a problem by trying different inputs and seeing what works. In this case, the LLM is optimizing the graph structure by choosing experiments and updating its predictions.
Okay, I see the connection. So let's talk about the method itself. How does IGDA actually work step by step?
First, it starts with a zero-shot prediction. The LLM looks at the variable names and descriptions and makes an initial guess about the graph structure. It also assigns a confidence score to each potential edge.
And then the interactive discovery phase begins, with rounds of experiments and updates.
Yep. In each round, the LLM sorts the edges by uncertainty, the ones with the lowest confidence, and selects a few to experiment on. It gets binary feedback on those edges and then uses that feedback to update its predictions and confidences, both for the experimented edges and their neighbors.
So it's constantly learning and refining its understanding of the graph. How do they measure the accuracy of the predictions?
They use the F1 score, which is a common way to evaluate binary classification problems. It combines precision and recall to give a balanced measure of accuracy.
Makes sense. And what were the results of their experiments?
Overall, IGDA performed really well. It consistently outperformed random selection and static confidence selection, where they just pick edges based on the initial confidence scores without any updates. It also held its own against a statistical method called gradient-based intervention targeting, or GIT.
That's impressive. So the uncertainty-driven selection and local updates are really making a difference.
Exactly. The authors also found that even when the initial LLM prediction wasn't great, IGDA could quickly recover and converge to the correct structure with local updates. That suggests the LLM is effectively using the experimental feedback, even without a lot of prior domain knowledge.
That's a key point. It means this approach could be useful even in areas where we don't have a deep understanding of the underlying relationships.
Right. The paper also highlights that the local updates are particularly valuable when you can only afford to experiment on a small fraction of the edges. They help you get the most bang for your buck.
And what about the comparison to GIT? How did IGDA stack up?
GIT performed well when it had plenty of observational and interventional data, but its performance dropped significantly when data was limited. IGDA, on the other hand, doesn't rely on that kind of data at all. It uses semantic metadata instead.
So it's a trade-off. GIT might be better when you have lots of numerical data, but IGDA is a good alternative when you don't.
Precisely. To understand IGDA's success better, the authors did a series of ablations where they removed or modified different parts of the pipeline.
Ablations are always helpful for figuring out what's really driving the results. What did they find?
They looked at the impact of experiment improvements versus update improvements, how much each contributed to the overall accuracy. They found that update improvements were most important early on, while experiment improvements became more dominant later in the process.
That makes sense. Early on, the local updates are helping the LLM learn quickly, but as it gets more data from experiments, those direct observations become more important.
Exactly. They also ablated the confidence-based edge selection and the local update prompting. They found that both were crucial for good performance. Without confidence selection, the LLM struggled to pick the right experiments. And without local updates, it couldn't effectively use the experimental feedback.
So it's a combination of smart experiment selection and effective information processing that makes IGDA work.
Yep. They also looked at the impact of the LLM model size. They found that larger models generally performed better, but even smaller models could do reasonably well on some graphs.
That's not too surprising. Larger models tend to have more knowledge and better reasoning abilities. But it's good to know that even smaller models can be useful in some cases.
Finally, they investigated the impact of memorization. They tested IGDA on a recently published graph that wasn't likely to be in the LLM's training data. They found that it still performed well, suggesting that it was actually reasoning about the relationships, not just regurgitating memorized facts.
That's a really important finding. It shows that IGDA has the potential to discover new knowledge, not just reproduce what it's already seen.
Exactly. So in conclusion, this paper presents IGDA as a promising new approach to interactive graph discovery. It leverages the power of LLMs to reason about semantic metadata and guide experiments, leading to accurate and efficient graph learning.
It sounds like a valuable tool for researchers in a variety of fields, especially those dealing with complex systems where data is limited. I'm curious to see how this research evolves in the future.
Me too. The authors suggest that future work could focus on combining numerical and semantic data to create even more powerful discovery methods. That seems like a natural next step. Okay, let's dive into this paper on hallucinations in large vision language models, or LVLMs. The title is Exploring Causes and Mitigation of Hallucinations in Large Vision Language Models.
Hallucinations, huh? So like when the AI describes things that aren't actually in the image? That sounds like a pretty big problem.
Exactly. The authors, Yaki-san and team from Kyoto University, define it as the model generating descriptions with objects or attributes that don't match the input image. They focus on image captioning, which makes it easier to pinpoint these errors.
So what's causing these LVLMs to go off the rails? Is it just bad training data?
Well, it's more nuanced than that. The paper points out that these models, which combine image encoders with large language models, or LLMs, tend to rely more on their language understanding as they generate captions. Basically, they start making stuff up later in the description.
So the language part of the model starts to take over and fill in the blanks, even if those blanks aren't supported by the image. Makes sense. They mentioned something called CLIP, right? How does that fit in?
CLIP, or Contrastive Language Image Pre-training, is a framework that maps images and text into a shared space. It's crucial for vision-language alignment. Think of it as teaching the model to understand the relationship between what it sees and what it reads. It's a foundation for many LVLMs.
Got it. So CLIP helps the model connect vision and language, but it's not a perfect solution. What are some of the specific issues they found with these LVLMs?
They found that hallucinations are more likely to pop up later in the caption. Also, the models can be inconsistent. They might correctly identify an object in a yes-no question, but hallucinate it in a generated caption. It's like the model has two different opinions about the same image.
That's wild. So it's not just about misinterpreting the image, but also about how the model uses its knowledge. What's their solution to this hallucination problem?
They came up with a clever approach. They compare the model's hidden representations, basically its internal understanding, when it's processing the image versus when it's not. If there's a big difference, it suggests the model is actually paying attention to the image. If not, it might be hallucinating.
Okay, so they're checking if the image is actually influencing the model's thinking. How do they automate this detection of hallucinations?
They built an automated pipeline that uses open vocabulary object detection tools. These tools can identify objects and images without being limited to a predefined list. The pipeline extracts objects mentioned in the caption and then checks if those objects are actually present in the image.
So it's like a fact checker for the AI's captions. That's pretty smart. And they use this to train a classifier, right?
Exactly. They train a token-level classifier. This classifier looks at the hidden representations and tries to predict whether each word or token in the caption is a hallucination or not.
And then they use this classifier to guide the model during the caption generation process.
Yep, they use a novel decoding method. During inference, the classifier helps to control the hallucination rate. It's like having a little editor that flags potentially made-up words, allowing the model to correct itself.
That sounds promising. So what kind of architectures are we talking about here? Are they building something completely new?
Not entirely. They're building on existing architectures. LVLMs typically connect pre-trained vision and language models using a lightweight projector. The vision encoder extracts visual tokens, and the projector maps them into the language model's space.
So it's about improving the connection between these existing components. They mention LL1157B. What's that?
LL1.57b is their base model. It's a popular LVLM that embodies current mainstream practices. It uses CLIP for vision encoding and Vicuna 7b as the language model. They train it in two stages. First, aligning visual and textual embeddings, and then fine-tuning it on instruction-following data.
Okay, so it's a representative model for this kind of research. What other approaches are out there for tackling these hallucinations?
There are training-based and training-free methods. Training-based methods involve fine-tuning the model with feedback data, often using reinforcement learning from human feedback or RLHF. But that can be expensive.
Yeah, I can imagine. Getting humans to label all those hallucinations would take forever. What about the training-free methods?
Training-free methods don't require fine-tuning. They can be inference time methods like Opera and VCD, which modify token distributions during generation, or post hoc frameworks like Lure and Woodpecker, which either revise the output or use visual grounding tools for validation.
So, Opera and VCD tweak the model's decisions as it's generating the caption, while Lure and Woodpecker clean up the mess afterwards. How does their approach compare to these?
Their method is training-free in the sense that it doesn't fine-tune the LVLM itself, but it does train a separate classifier. Unlike Opera and VCD, it doesn't need manual parameter tuning. And unlike Lure and Woodpecker, it doesn't rely on external tools during decoding, allowing for real-time control.
That sounds like a good balance. What about evaluating these models? How do you even measure hallucinations objectively?
That's a tough one. There are discriminative assessment methods like POPE and ROPE, which ask the model yes-no questions about object existence. There's also AMBER, which evaluates both generative and discriminative performance. But free-form text evaluation is still a challenge.
Yeah, it's hard to automatically judge if a caption is hallucinating without some kind of reference. They mention chair and hallubench. What are those?
Chair evaluates object hallucinations, but needs object segmentation annotations. Hallubench uses GPT-4 to evaluate hallucinations against detailed descriptions. The problem is that both rely on ground truth annotations, which are expensive and time-consuming to create.
So the holy grail is to evaluate hallucination levels without needing reference data. That would make it much easier to improve these models. Let's get back to their method. How exactly does this token-level classifier work?
They use a multi-layer perceptron, or MLP, classifier. It takes the hidden states from the LVLM both with and without the image as input and predicts whether each token is hallucinated. They found that using the difference between these hidden states gives the best results.
That makes sense. The difference highlights how the image is influencing the model's internal representation. And then they use this classifier to guide the decoding process.
Exactly. They use a decoding strategy that involves sampling multiple candidate sentences, evaluating their accuracy using the classifier, and then selecting the best one. It's an iterative process that aims to generate the most accurate caption possible.
So it's like a feedback loop, where the classifier helps the model refine its output. What kind of results did they get?
Their methods significantly reduced hallucination rates compared to baselines like greedy decoding, Opera, and VCD. They used the chair metric to measure this. The trade-off is that higher accuracy thresholds can sometimes exclude accurate descriptions as well.
Okay, so there's a balance between reducing hallucinations and maintaining descriptive detail. What are some of the limitations of their approach?
They acknowledge that their method might mistakenly penalize descriptions that naturally align with statistical patterns in the training data. Also, they only used basic vector subtraction to compare hidden layer representations. More sophisticated distance metrics might improve performance.
And the classifier is model-specific, right? So you'd have to retrain it for each new LVLM.
That's right. The hidden layer vectors are highly model-specific. Also, the classifier learns correlations between token positions and hallucination probability, which limits its applicability to other tasks.
So it's a good step forward, but there's still room for improvement. What are their final thoughts on the causes of these hallucinations?
They conclude that many hallucinations arise not from incorrect visual encoding, but from language priors overriding visual information during caption generation. The model shifts from image-guided text generation to purely language-driven prediction.
That's a key insight. It's not just about seeing the image correctly, but about controlling how the model uses its language knowledge. Any ideas on how to address this in the future?
They suggest that synthetic training data might contain fixed patterns that amplify the role of language priors. They also point out that image captioning might have different hallucination mechanisms than other VQA tasks, suggesting the need for more generalized solutions.
So it's about creating more diverse and realistic training data and developing more robust methods that can handle different types of tasks. Sounds like there's plenty of work left to do in this area.
So this paper is all about making conversational AI more human-like by giving it a better theory of mind, or ToM. What's the big idea here?
Exactly. The authors are tackling a really important problem. Current AI, even with those massive language models, struggles to understand the mental states of people they're talking to. Humans do this instinctively. We consider beliefs, desires, and intentions. AI, not so much.
Okay. So ToM is basically understanding that other people have their own thoughts, feelings, and motivations that might be different from yours. How do they break that down in the paper?
They use something called the Belief Desire Intention (BDI) model. It's a framework from psychology. Basically, people have beliefs about the world, desires for what they want, and intentions to act in certain ways. The paper explores how to get language models to recognize and use these components.
Got it. So it's not just about spitting out grammatically correct sentences, but actually understanding why someone is saying something. What are some of the issues that arise when AI lacks ToM?
Well, the paper mentions some pretty serious concerns. Things like fake alignment, where the AI seems to agree with you, but doesn't really, deception, and even manipulation. They also talk about reward hacking, where the AI finds unintended ways to achieve its goals, and goal misgeneralization, where it applies goals in inappropriate situations.
Yikes, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. So how are they trying to fix this ToM deficiency?
They're experimenting with open-source language models, specifically Llama, to see if they can capture and preserve ToM-related information. They're also trying to explicitly manipulate beliefs, desires, and intentions to see if it improves how the AI responds.
And what did they find? Does tinkering with those BDI components actually make a difference?
Yep. Their experiments showed that incorporating ToM-informed alignment does improve response quality. They even got win rates of 67% and 63% for the 3B and 8B Llama models respectively. That means in a head-to-head comparison, the ToM-aligned models were preferred by human evaluators more often.
That's pretty significant. So how do they actually measure ToM in these language models? It's not like you can just ask them what they're thinking, right?
They use a technique called probing. It's like taking snapshots of the internal states of the language model while it's processing language. Then, they train another model to predict ToM-related information from those snapshots. They also use patching, which involves altering parts of the model to see how it affects the output.
So it's like poking around inside the AI's brain to see how it represents beliefs, desires, and intentions. What kind of data are they using to train and test these models?
They use a few different data sets. One is called Ticino, which is a collection of conversations about dividing items for a picnic. Another is Craigslist Bargain, which focuses on negotiations over used items. They also use Phantom and Negotiation ToM, which are specifically designed to assess ToM consistency.
Okay, so real-world conversations and some data sets designed to specifically test ToM. What's this latent QA thing they keep mentioning?
Latent QA is an architecture they use for interpreting the internal representations of the language model. It's like framing the problem as a visual question-answering task. But instead of images, the visual part is the activation values from the language model's layers. It helps them extract ToM-related information and then use it to steer the model's responses.
So they're essentially teaching the AI to read its own internal state and then use that information to generate more appropriate responses. What were some of the key findings from their experiments?
One big takeaway is that ToM-related information seems to be best represented in the middle layers of the language model. The shallow layers might not be semantically rich enough, while the deep layers might be too focused on self-centric information from the pre-training data.
Interesting. So it's like there's a sweet spot in the middle where the AI has enough context but hasn't become overly biased. What about the consistency of ToM? Can the AI maintain a coherent understanding of someone's mental state throughout a conversation?
That's still a challenge. The paper suggests that current language models don't exhibit a perfectly consistent understanding of ToM. However, their latent QA approach shows promise compared to other methods like chain-of-thought reasoning and fine-tuning.
So there's room for improvement, but they're on the right track. What about actually controlling the AI's behavior using ToM? Can they make it more empathetic or persuasive by manipulating its understanding of someone's beliefs or desires?
That's where it gets really interesting. Their results suggest that leveraging ToM to steer language models towards generating aligned responses is a promising direction. They saw win rates of around 67% and 63% when they manipulated beliefs, desires, and intentions.
That's pretty cool. So, by tweaking the AI's understanding of someone's mental state, they can actually influence its behavior and make it more human-like. What are some of the limitations of this research?
One limitation is that they relied on other language models to evaluate the responses. Ideally, they would have used human judges for a more reliable assessment. Also, they only used one data set for the controllability experiments, and generating aligned responses can be tricky and sensitive to hyperparameter tuning.
Okay, so there's definitely room for improvement in the evaluation methods and the diversity of data. What are some of the ethical concerns that arise from this kind of research?
The big one is the potential for misuse. If you can manipulate AI based on its understanding of a user's mental state, you could potentially enable mind reading or manipulative behaviors. It's a dual-edged sword. It could lead to more empathetic interactions, but it also carries the risk of exploitation.
Definitely something to think about. So what's next for this research? Where do they see this going in the future?
They want to integrate these techniques into real-world AI agents and refine their evaluation methodologies. They also want to expand their experiments to include a wider variety of language models. Ultimately, they see this as a step towards generating more aligned and human-like responses in dialogue systems.
All right, let's dive into this survey on protein large language models. It's a pretty comprehensive look at how these models are changing protein science.
Definitely. It's amazing how far we've come from traditional methods like X-ray crystallography, NMR, and cryo-EM. Those techniques are so time-consuming and labor-intensive. Protein LLMs seem to offer a much more efficient alternative.
Exactly. The core idea is that proteins, like language, have a structure and grammar. Protein LLMs learn this language from massive datasets of protein sequences. They're trained in a self-supervised manner, meaning they learn from the data itself without needing explicit labels.
So it's like teaching a computer to predict the next word in a sentence, but instead of words, it's predicting the next amino acid in a protein sequence.
Precisely. They use techniques like masked language modeling, where they predict missing amino acids, or autoregressive modeling, where they predict the next amino acid in the sequence. This allows them to learn intricate patterns and relationships within protein sequences.
That makes sense. The survey mentions different architectures for protein LLMs. What are some of the key differences?
Well, initially researchers used LSTM architectures, which are a type of recurrent neural network. But the real breakthrough came with transformer architectures, which are now the dominant paradigm. These models can scale up to billions of parameters and are trained on millions of protein sequences.
And what about the data they're trained on? What kind of data sets are we talking about?
The survey highlights several key data sets. UniProt-KB is a big one. It's a comprehensive protein sequence and annotation database. It has two main parts, SwissProt, which is manually curated and high quality, and Tremble, which is automatically annotated and provides broader coverage. Then there's UniRef, which clusters protein sequences to reduce redundancy and improve computational efficiency.
So it's like having different levels of detail and redundancy in the data. What about datasets that include structural information?
Good question. The Protein Data Bank, or PDB, is a crucial resource for 3D structural data of proteins, and then there's AlphaFold-DB, which offers predicted protein structures generated by the AlphaFold model. These structural datasets are really important for training models that can predict protein folding.
Okay, so we have the models, the data. How do we actually evaluate how well these protein LLMs are performing?
There are several metrics depending on the task. For structure prediction, we use things like root mean square deviation, RMSD, which measures the distance between predicted and actual atomic coordinates. Lower RMSD is better. There's also the global distance test, GDTTS, which calculates the percentage of correctly predicted alpha carbon atoms.
And for function prediction?
For function prediction, it gets a bit more complex. We use standard machine learning metrics like precision, recall, and F1 score. But we also look at things like how well the model predicts subcellular localization, where the protein is located within the cell, and how accurately it can detect homology, meaning evolutionary relationships to other proteins.
The survey also mentions sequence generation. How do you evaluate a model that's creating new protein sequences?
That's where metrics like perplexity come in. Perplexity measures how well the model predicts amino acids. Lower perplexity means better prediction. We also look at novelty, how unique the generated sequences are compared to known proteins, and diversity, which measures the range of different sequences the model can generate.
So it's not just about accuracy, but also about creativity and exploring new possibilities in protein space.
Exactly. And then there's foldability, whether the generated sequence can actually fold into a stable 3D structure. That's crucial for the protein to be functional.
This is all fascinating. What are some of the key applications of these protein LLMs?
The survey highlights applications in protein prediction, annotation, and design. They can predict protein folding, annotate biological functions, and even design novel proteins with desired characteristics. This has huge implications for biomedical research and protein engineering.
It sounds like protein LLMs are becoming essential tools for scientific discovery in protein science. What are some of the challenges and future directions?
One big challenge is protein dynamics. AlphaFold can predict accurate static 3D structures, but proteins are naturally dynamic molecules with various conformations. Incorporating these dynamics into the models is a key area for future research. Another direction is combining protein LLMs with single-cell data to understand pathways in specific cells.
And what about interpretability? Can we understand why these models are making certain predictions?
That's a crucial point. Interpretability is essential for building trustworthy models. Some researchers are using techniques like sparse autoencoders to extract biologically meaningful features from protein LLMs, revealing their alignment with known biological concepts. Designing prompts to enhance interpretability is also an important area of focus.
It sounds like there's still a lot of work to be done, but the potential of protein LLMs is enormous. They could really revolutionize how we understand and manipulate proteins.
Absolutely. This survey provides a great overview of the current state of the field and highlights the exciting challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. Wow, that was quite the journey through the AI landscape. From the surprising impact of instruction order on language models to the microscopic world of protein science, it's clear that AI is pushing boundaries in unexpected ways.
Definitely. I'm still thinking about how something as simple as rearranging instructions can throw an AI for a loop. It really highlights how much we still have to learn about how these models process information.
And that interactive graph discovery paper. The idea of AI acting like a detective, piecing together relationships with limited information, is just fascinating. It opens up so many possibilities for exploring complex systems where data is scarce.
Absolutely. And the work on tackling hallucinations in vision language models is crucial. It's not enough for AI to see things. It needs to see them accurately. That research is a big step towards more reliable and trustworthy AI systems.
Right. And let's not forget about giving AI a theory of mind. Teaching AI to understand our intentions and beliefs could lead to much more natural and empathetic interactions. It's a game changer for conversational AI.
And then there's the protein stuff. The idea of AI mastering the language of proteins and designing new ones is mind-blowing. It could revolutionize medicine and materials science.
It's amazing how these different areas connect. Whether it's crafting better prompts, building AI detectives, or designing new proteins, the underlying theme is about understanding and harnessing the power of AI in a responsible and innovative way.
Couldn't agree more. It feels like we're just scratching the surface of what's possible. Who knows what exciting breakthroughs await us in the next episode?